Beep. All right, welcome to the Visual Div. How are you doing, Matt? What's the
I'm very
crack?
good,
It's been a
thanks.
long time.
It has been. We got a special guest today, though, to
We
keep us
do. We've got
keen.
Alessia here, back for round two.
Hello, hello. Good to
How you
be
doing,
here again.
Alessia?
I'm good,
Yeah,
all good. It's been super busy couple of months, but yeah, looking forward to Christmas break now.
It has been crazy, actually, the last couple of months. The last pod we did was in between the two conferences, and I went to a conference, and then both Matt and I got crazy busy, and we weren't able to align our times. And like literally last week, we were kind of talking about what we're doing with this and with the pod, and kind of got excited again to do it. And around time, we were trying to figure out like topics, what will we talk about, and both of us were kind of going back and forth about components, and that's where Matt was like, "I'm reaching out to Alessia later on. We need to talk about components."
Yes. I mean, Webflow released tons of stuff about like small and big changes on components,
Hmm.
and I think there is a lot more to come as well. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah, like I've been using them a lot, and I think why this is going to be really good is that we're on a couple of different we work for different kind of inverted commas clients. So what I'm trying to do is I used to use the CMS to make repeatable HTML templates. So I'm trying to reverse engineer what I've built to use components to make things repeatable and easier to manage. Because there has been times that um, I'll give you like one of the main examples of with what I'm building is there's multiple sign up forms depending on the client because first of all we only let certain people access the product, and then if they are verified, the person is verified, then it goes to a specific sign up form for that individual and their company, and then they get a specific version of the product. So I was using CMS templates for that, but as requirements of um, different companies changed, the customization of that template became more complicated because they needed specific terms and conditions, and that needed to be stored somewhere else. So the same tick box had to send data in different places, or some people wanted to use a specific code so that they could get in and writing the logic for that, and then having the front end, um, be unique became more and more difficult with using CMS templates. So that's why I don't. Was it last week or the week before? I was saying forms. There's an issue with forms, Webflow native forms being a component and using slots. So I'm like reverse engineering everything that I've built over the last probably 18 months to now incorporate slots and components specifically with forms. And I'm really loving it actually. It's annoying having to reverse engineer this or rebuild something that I've already built, but I can see already how it's going to speed up my processes. And for when we're onboarding another client in 2 or 3 months' time, building out a unique onboarding experience for them is going to be like super easy.
How did you fix it in the end? Because just the problem that you were having is that you cannot have a slot inside of the native
Yeah.
Webflow form. So did you use the custom element in the end?
Yes. So I'll give you the kind of the breakdown of what I did. So first of all, I was saying there that I was using the CMS template, so there would just be a form there, and then I was originally using components to drop um, like repeatable elements that I wanted throughout the product. Like, so let's say I wanted to know where someone was located, in what country they were located in. I would use a component initially to have the country options in there. And then if a new country came on board, I could just drop it into one place and then that would replicate across the whole product. So that's what I was initially using them for. Then what I wanted to do, um, so I had all the inputs created as components so that they could repeat across the product. But what I needed to do recently was one company needed one specific terms and conditions. So I needed to have um, two separate terms and conditions check boxes for them, just whatever the agreement we had. But I didn't want that on the other companies. So you could remove that with Webflow CMS using the using their filters, but the element was still there on the front end because it's just invisible, like it's just set to none. Or I could start building out unique component pages. So that's what I started doing. And the first one I built out was using a form and then tried to add slots in it, and it didn't work for what I wanted to do. So I have now got a form it actually isn't on it, the users aren't using it yet, but I have built a form that has all the individual slots and components and the different filters set inside it so that I can customize it based on what we have needed so far with the various different companies we work for. And I will be this is kind of the scary thing, is migrating from something that works to like moving it over. And it seems like such a simple thing. It's like, you're just, hey, this is the way we used to build the forms, this is the way I'm building it now. So I'm kind of like on the fence of like, do I just leave what we have there, it's working okay, and then all new clients will use the components, the custom element form?
It's an interesting one because whenever Webflow release new stuff, you just think it should be applicable to whatever you're doing. So, you want to we want to get our hands on it, but then if clients get wind of it, they almost want to go, hey, can I make use of this new feature? But sometimes you have to sit back and go, is this actually beneficial? Like you were saying, I'm just ripping up something that's working just to get something in that's also going to be working. But so it'll be interesting to see, can we pull apart the actual benefits of what all these new features are? Because I've come in from a background where I built I tried to price a project based on components this time last year, and it was all right, but as I started to look to use components, I realized a lot of the use cases were a little bit, I was kind of hacking it. So I ended up building the site, and it's got some components and some haven't got components. Whereas now all these little features have come out. I'm going, hey, dear client, we can now do it in a componentized system, but it relies on me, rebuilding 50% of the website. And it's something that I'm not actively working for this client because we've already done all that work. But maybe next year it's a case of, guys, look, just all these new features coming out. Do you want me to make it more future-proof, more flexible for your marketing team, more, all this kind of stuff with all these new features? And it's an interesting one because, like with Webflow, I think we spoke about this in a previous episode. It's like sometimes they ship so quickly with new features that like 6 months later, the things that you were doing or the way you were doing it is kind of a little bit out of date, or at least it's not out of date. It's just not working to the potential. So, like Alessia, have you had any? Are you bringing this into like client conversations just for everyone, or are you sort of assessing how it might help some clients, hinder other clients, be appropriate for some? Where's your mind with? Because then we can go into maybe the detail of each feature, but how are you treating it as a kind of feature set in front of your clients? Because that's really what everyone needs to consider, isn't it? It's great if it works, but only really if we can sell it to our clients and it benefits them,
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to say the answer that everyone probably hates is like, it depends. So it depends on the client. It depends what they need. What we started kind of selling more and more is a design system more than just a website. So instead of going in and being like, okay, these are set amount of pages that you need, like you kind of mentioned, like price per components. So it's like, oh, okay, you've designed these, I don't know, 4 pages. I can see from these 4 pages that you need all of these various combinations or variants of components. So we're going to build these, and then your team can go ahead and build some other pages. And then if more components are needed, that's when they can loop us back in. So that's one approach to this, but that only works with clients who maybe have a bigger team, or they have a marketing and content team that can take on the additional pages and they know exactly what they want from the new pages. So yeah, kind of giving them the tools to then build it themselves. There's then other clients that are not technical at all. So even if you put them in front of drag and drop components, they're like, no, I'd rather you do it for me, because I know that at least everything is set up correctly, even if it's set up to be used for clients. So I feel like those are kind of the two main boxes of clients, the ones which feel more confident in the designer and they're like, oh yeah, I know, I have a basic level of kind of website knowledge, even if it's not coding, but they're comfortable dragging and dropping sections within pages. Then those are probably the ones where components make the more sense, because they're like, finally, I can do all of this myself, versus the ones which are still quite scared of the whole web building scenario, whether it's with components or not. So I feel like, yeah, it really depends who you're selling it to, and whether they also understand the design side of things. Like, what is a design system? Do they understand what the possibilities that introduces and what that means? Versus, nah, I just want a site and that's it.
Yeah. Do you ever think about the our side of the fence? Because I listened to a podcast the other day, and they were talking about these page builders. They didn't sort of call out Webflow specifically, but I think they were sort of referring to it. And one of the things they were mentioning is this: the idea of Pandora's box is, once you give someone who's not necessarily fully proficient with, say, Webflow, once they open that door into that room and it's full of these nice new shiny toys, and they can move things around and they can drag and drop and they can, chaos ensues. So you get chaos in the irresponsible client who just messes around and then calls you up and goes, hey, I've messed around, like, can you fix it? But you also get the other side of it, which is they poke around a little bit more responsibly, but that gets them going and go, oh, can we do this now? Or can we do this now? And then the whole design system, and design systems are hard. They're hard to build because you've got to think about lots of different edge cases and use cases and all this kind of stuff. But sometimes you get to that point where they go, oh, you've done this, great, now can you do this? And you go, well, if you'd asked this in the first place, I would have built it a completely different way. Or, and because I know Webflow now they've got component variants. Slots is, like, for me, slots, I'm still trying to find the real benefit of slots. And then you have slots inside slots. And then you have, you get variants of things that are in the slots. And it's there's so much going on that I don't know. Like, obviously, Webflow's conference was a little bit more about this empowering the marketing team. They had analyze and optimize. And I'm still trying to get my head around whether components actually make it easier for clients. And I know the depends is pretty important. Like, if they have a big marketing team and they want to get into it, they can get into it. But I've got a client that wants to get into it, but they're not really going to invest the time in learning the why. And therefore, putting them a big component system in front of them, they'll still come back to me and go, it doesn't quite work like I want it to work, but they think it can work like that. So you have to go. And then, my time as well. Like, how am I selling my time? Am I saying, 2 hours to fix a component to make it work like you want it to? Or do I build you that page with components, and then as I'm building them, do I build in different features for that component to make it work on the next page? It's like, it's so hard to get my head around.
What's okay? I get all of that, and the funny thing is that I'm kind of both the client and the developer in this instance. So I'm not selling anymore the way both of you are to loads and loads of clients. I've got a boss, and I've got my time, and I've got all these things that need to be done yesterday. So, and I'm just on the slots and slides, a component with slots and slots. The use case that I have found is this form that I've built. and why I'm reverse engineering all the other forms into this custom element component that is a form with inputs that are slots inside, and potentially a slot inside, like a select input, for example, that I can add to or take away from. So in that instance, like I'm actually both the client, the person that there will be using the design system that will be developing for myself, because future me needs to do things quicker. And I am
Well,
iterating. I am
that's interesting
iterating.
because I think you're actually more common than you think. You're unique because you're working in a company, but I think
Yeah.
even for us, we sometimes are doing that. We're like, I'm going to build it in a component, so when I get the next brief to build a landing page in 2 weeks' time, it's going to be quicker for me to do it as well. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's a common problem, not necessarily exactly like yours, but it's like, how are you solving that? Because are you thinking, okay, it'll take me less time, or but I understand how it works, or do I need to write documents to see how it works just in case I don't know I'm not here, and you know.
Yeah, there's definitely is that issue if I get hit by a bus. Who's going to know what's going on in this product? But the if the reason I built used a CMS template to build out multiple forms was speed and repeatability. So, but it always has, when you're using the Webflow CMS template, the customization of one template relative to the other is a problem, because it's not like you can hide things based on, like, if there's an input somewhere, like, the things can be manipulated, but it really, it's not a really perfect solution for having, slight variance of a repeatable thing. So that's why I've kind of I moved over to building a component, and it'll be a heap of static pages under a folder, and then the form components itself will be way more customizable than what it would be in a CMS. The end result is going to be pretty much the exact same, but I know that um, when I'm building the next one, it's just going to be minutes instead of um, whatever it takes now. Because the problem with using the CMS solution is, once you hit that customization, there's a lot of thinking around how to make it work in this repeatable HTML template that you've created. Whereas when it comes to components and slots, it's this: I built the building bricks, put it together. If there's an iteration on that, it's actually way, way easier. And that's, if you think of it in terms of a form with an input, and then that input is a select input or a drop down, and you only have 3 options, but you actually want to put in at a future date 4 options or 5 options, that's very, very customizable with components and slots. And it's working out really, really well. Um, and also, another little thing that is kind of getting into the weeds, but static pages load faster than Webflow CMS pages. So it's
Ooh.
actually, it's ever so slightly, but it is faster when you've just got the static pages to have those pages loading. So that's a performance thing as well. Um,
Alessia, are you doing any of this sort of CMS to component, like sort of rejigs, or are you more coming at it from a not the CMS side, but more like the landing page side? Because I know you've sort of got or you're building out a framework. Or is it,
Yes.
well, is it a framework, or is it like a clonable with loads of pre-built components in it? Like
Um, it's still work in progress, so it's kind of
yeah.
in between the two at the moment. But yeah, when starting with components, I find there's two ways of building. So one, which was also very much used before variants, was you build up like the section as a component, and then you have various sections that the client can swap in and out. But what I found is that could also be quite limiting, because if that section hasn't been built as a component, then the client can't easily create one or duplicate one. and so forth. So I kind of gave myself the challenge of, what if we had kind of a design system that even just the layouts are components? So when Webflow released slots, that's where I found the most possibilities, is that you could have components just to define the layout. So, for example, a grid layout with 3 columns, that could be, its own component, and the grid layout is actually set on the slot. So you could add as many components inside of the slot, and it would just fill the columns. So now
which is
I'm trying out this combination of layout components with maybe more traditional components of, I don't know, a card or a button, or, what people usually use components for. And the combination of the two, you're kind of still dropping in various components, but one could just determine the layout and then drop in the elements inside of it. So I'm experimenting it with a few different clients, especially the ones who are very interested in design systems and very flexible components. Because what you can do is then, for that grid example, you can have different variants for how many columns you want. So you have one component to define the layout, whether it's 2 column, 3 column, 4 columns, and so forth, with just a drop down, and then you can drop in inside like all the different components inside of it.
Yeah, it's like my brain's going mad because I can't even visualize what it is, what the those webs. There used to be a website thing that you could look at a website and it would turn it into a 3D map of all the layers, almost like the CSS and HTML layers. This is what I'm struggling with at the moment, is because, say, you could go up to the page level, couldn't you, and say, right, this page is a slot, okay, which is almost like a lock and key situation where it's like, if it hasn't been built as a component, you can't put it in this page.
Yeah.
Which is kind of nice, because a lot of times you come back after 2, 3, 4 weeks with a client and they put something into the page. I've got a few clients who've done that before, where they put in this massive like pop-up banner sort of thing that they've designed themselves because they didn't want to bother me because it costs money, all that kind of thing. And you're like, this has just ruined the whole flow. It's not in the grid. It's not in, but you could lock that down with slots. Or you could go down to this section level where each section has a sort of a lock and key where, like, there's 2, so you can only put one and another. And that, again, helps with consistency of a design system, I suppose. But I guess then as you start going even smaller into these, like, atomic elements, like I've seen, people have buttons with icons, and the icon is a slot that you drop an icon into. And if you don't put an icon in there, then you just get a normal button. Even though interestingly, the slot still renders unless you hide it, which is really annoying. I think that's an oversight, but I don't know. Maybe there's more technical reasons for that. But the thing I struggle with is that let's say, take Mast, for example. Mast, I love Mast versus, say, client first, and maybe use Relium as an example. Is that Relium has loads of components, pre-built components, but they're not components. They're just
not
layouts.
Really components.
No, right? And they don't have a consistent layout structure in terms of classes. So client first doesn't have that. Mast does. Mast, I think, is USP, is it has rows and columns. And what I think you alluded to there was you're almost building that layout system, but you're using classes to build the layout system to start with. You're just turning them into slots, and then they're sort of fixed as those kind of slots. So Alan's currently taken a picture of a picture.
No one would have known that. The reason I'm doing it is because there's like 4 cows like literally outside my window, and I just think it's kind of funny that we're recording a blog and there's 4 cows. You didn't need to be distracted by that, Matt. I could have just sent it to you later.
I kind of had a feeling that you had some sort of
there
something going on outside.
I'm imagining like rows and columns, and we're talking. I'm like, so there's a row of 4 cows,
and each cow is a slot.
And each cow is a slot. There's slightly different variations of one. 2 of them are facing left, One is facing
One's
right.
a milking slot. The other one's a steak slot. The
Now they're
other
all
one's
steak slots,
organic.
unfortunately, and you can't declare it's all. They're growing steaks.
Anyway, let's like with the cows. Okay, so we've got no, but we've got all these slots that are in layouts, or these components that fit inside that layout. But then obviously behind all that, we've got all the class system. So let's call that the framework. The client first or the mask.
Yeah.
So it's trying to work out when the class system that you use almost disappears from view from the client, and
It does.
the slots take over, and where that then shifts the dynamic between the client and the developers. Because a lot of in that podcast I was referred to, I'll put it in the show notes. But the idea was that building page builders means there's less reliance on developers to do the page building. But what they were saying was, and I agree and disagree with some of them, but you can build more simple stuff with these slots and components. But when it starts to get into more complex stuff, they have to pick up the phone more often to you because they can't actually get behind the thinking or the building behind the components. So it's a weird one because I think when I saw the marketing stuff with Webflow conference, I was like, there's nothing for me here. There's, and then when you boil it down, you realize actually someone's going to have to build all these systems to allow people to, Webflow aren't building. Well, they are and there aren't. There's, the AI, talk of AI components and all that kind of stuff. But at the moment, they still need you and I and Aline to build a system for them to use. And then once that system's in place, are they then beholden to that system? And like the dynamics are interesting. I think we're all in a bit of flux because I still say I don't know whether to use them or not because sometimes they're helpful, sometimes they're not helpful, sometimes they're helpful in 6 months' time. I get a lot of clients will go, maybe I need that. Maybe I need a different type of button in 6 months' time. Maybe I'll need a landing page that needs a form in it. Maybe, it's all these what ifs, maybes, and all that design thinking has to go into the building of the components and the slots. And sometimes it just feels easier just to build it without components. And then when they need something new, just give me a call and I'll just build something new. Because it's going to take me ages to think about this stuff I don't know. It's maybe for the big companies, it works better, but for my kind of client, I don't know if it's a net benefit, if that makes sense.
Well, I think with that one, like that's kind of what Alessia was saying at the start. Is it does depend, but if you can incorporate it into your speed of development, then it's definitely worth investing in it. And like you were talking there about once the limitations of a design system is reached, or then the developer has to be called anyway. But have you? Yes, you've used Framer, but have you guys used Squarespace or Shopify in the past? I used to use Shopify a lot.
Not in
And
a very
Shopify,
long time.
but its whole USP is that there's templates and there's a load of flexibility within those templates. But the templates hit a limitation. They like sometimes it is you're able to put 4 columns into a section and that's it. You can't put any more. Or this section only has 1 or 2 columns and then you can't do any more. I remember like there's even in like Shopify, when I used to work with it a lot more, the idea of like a direct add to cart button was something you had to go into the liquid and add it manually in the custom code. It wasn't readily available with a lot of the templates. So I think it doesn't matter what the system is. If you're making it to be easy to use, you're going to come up with limitations and someone has to be called. And that was one of the things inside of Shopify. It was just once those limitations were hit, the access to an expert was very seamless. Like a couple of button clicks, you could find someone that was going to solve your problem. So you probably have to think of it in two ways. It's one, is it going to make your processes quicker? And is the investment of that time worth it. Like for me at the moment, definitely is for certain cases. Like I haven't gone down the way you're thinking there, Alessia, of having sections with individual components, sections as slots with components inside them. But I could see how that could be used. Um, and then it's the yeah, like once you've put the constraints in there, that something is really easy to use. Like I suppose that's a part of the design process as well, is to making sure that something doesn't break. You'd rather something have a limitation and they have to ask you to increase on that limitation than give them, like access to the designer and then it breaks. Be my
Yeah,
kind.
it's a balance between how flexible you want it to be and how easy you want it to be. You can't. Well, we're getting closer and closer to having both, but there's still that trade-off. If you want to just drag and drop sections, then you have to build the whole sections, and then you're limited on how many sections you have. If you're creating a more flexible where the layouts itself are components, then it's a little bit harder to use, but more flexible. So it's kind of that flexibility versus ease of use that I'm currently experimenting with. And then it also depends on the design, right? If each page is completely different, then it's probably not worth to have a design system or like component based, because they're all like individually used. But if you have a lot of pages, and I think it works best with bigger sites or like bigger companies where they do want a design system because they don't want to spend a lot of time designing each individual page if you have hundreds of pages. So that's when I think a design system based on components makes more sense versus a 3-page site and each page is different and they all have different custom animations. Then it's probably not worth it. And then going back on classes, Matt, you mentioned kind of masking that whole class system from the client. That's something I noticed. So for example, if you build section by section and you go inside of the component and then you see all the classes, that's kind of one level in. And then you're exposing the classes to the client eventually if they do go into a component and they might change things, and all of a sudden all the 100 pages are broken because they changed that one thing in that one component or however it is. Like we all know, the client changes one class and then all of a sudden they change it in 100 different places. But I've noticed, especially with one client that I was building for, where I used the layout components, is basically you're masking the client from any classes, because you're go inside of a component and then you have other components. So unless you go very deep in, they never see the classes. They always see all the different components and then they have different variants to choose from. So you could completely mask the client from the classes, and then it's only you who know what the underlying classes are that you created.
Yeah, it's a good segue because we haven't really touched on variants, and that's a relatively recent feature that came out. We've seen, there's been a few alpha and beta tests going on, but we haven't really seen the output. But one of those outputs is that where before we would have built components and we might have put a freeform class field and gone light mode or dark mode or primary button or secondary button. And now we can create variants that the client, all they have to do is click on a drop down and go, I want the secondary button or the dark mode version of this. And behind the scenes, the developer has done all the hard work of working out what needs to change, how it needs to change. And then you have I think they have like responsive type variants as well. So you can have a different a variation of a component on a different size screen, essentially. Or is that coming down the line?
One variant, but you can give different CSS to different breakpoints.
Different breakpoints, which is very similar to what you could do now, I suppose, but it's just inside a variant, which is inside a component. So, but you're right. So that's almost taking it from the bottom up, isn't it? Buttons and nav bars and all this kind of stuff that you are sort of that they're consistent across the board. I think it's when it starts getting to layout stuff that it starts to become, you do have to hand over that little manual with your design system and component system and go, guys, this is how it works. Because invariably you can, when everyone, well, maybe it's, I think a lot of people do this, but you put buttons and options in front of people, they start clicking buttons and options, and it starts causing chaos. So it's almost like you need to give them a little playground to play with so they can practice all these things, whether that's a separate clonable or a component page or a folder of component pages where they can play around. But generally, yeah, I suppose the fact is, unless they really know what they're doing, you can make it so it's very hard to make a mess of everything because you're putting it behind options. I suppose that's one of the benefits. And I guess it's segueing onto this sort of how do you price your services based on components? Because Alan, I suppose you're in a unique situation where you're pricing it in your head because you're pricing it on time. It's like, if I invest the time here, it's going to pay me back in 2 weeks' time when I roll out these 20 new forms, say, for example. But when I'm thinking about it, I'm going, if I do it this way now, right, there's two things I'm thinking about. One, is it going to save my client time? And it's not so much saving them time. It's more like, are they going to value my build better? Am I delivering them a lot more value for their buck? Because I'm building them a componentized system, which means that they can extend this and use them in different scenarios. And the other end is like, it's going to take me a lot more time to build this, a little bit more design thinking. More things can go wrong because I'm building it this way. I might not be able to do it as quickly, and therefore should I charge for that time and that price? Like we all go value-based pricing, but it's very hard to know what value-based pricing is. But I went down to thinking I bill per page, and straight away, if I look at a page and go a design and go, oh, yeah, that'll take me 2 days. Okay, I kind of work it out and give them a price. And now I'm going, well, if it's got components in it, well, maybe it's double because I'm taking double the time. But then later on down the road, I'm going to be able to build page 6, 7, and 8 a lot more quickly because I've got these components. And it's such a jigsaw to try and fit together when we're kind of standardized and going, this is a design, it'll take X amount of time to build. Therefore, I'm going to give you this price, fixed price, here's the scope, off you go. So I think we're getting into a new world of like, how do you price things up? Because unless you put yourself on a meter, which a lot of people do, I suppose, like a day rate or a half day rate, I think it's actually quite hard for everyone to win at the same time. So
Well,
I don't know how you guys are doing it or trying to do it, because I guess it's relatively new as well.
yeah, I haven't really changed the way I price things because I find there's, like you said, more time up front when you set everything up and we're trying to figure out which components to build, and like when you look at the design, how to build this in the most flexible but componentized way. But then, like you say, the next pages might be quicker. So it's more of a time shift where you spend more time up front and then it becomes quicker down the line. And I mean, like you said, it's fairly new, so I'm still experimenting with things, but the overall time might stay the same. So does that mean that we should price the same? What I'm definitely doing as an add-on, which I price additional time, is because if you create the whole design system, you kind of also need the blueprint on how to use the design system. So if the client just wants to build the website and the scope doesn't change from before using components, then the kind of scoping stays the same. But if they definitely ask for a design system that needs to be documented and then needs to be taught, then that's an extra kind of add-on to the pricing. So it's like, oh, we'll build the whole components and we'll build the whole site, but then we need to spend additional time to document everything. And that documentation is what's kind of the add-on time for all the components. I mean, that's how I'm approaching it at the moment.
Yeah, because
So
you're passing on your expertise there. Because if they're like saying, "Hey, we don't want the expert anymore," you're like, "Okay, that's fine," but the expert needs to teach the novice how to use it, and that has value. Um, yeah, that's a great approach. When like just there where you were saying about like I definitely wouldn't change my pricing at all because you are front loading it, and it doesn't matter if you're using components or if you're using masters client first. The very first page is always the longest.
yeah.
It doesn't matter what way you're doing this. The last page is the quickest. And if you're doing like a very clean price per page kind of thing, maybe a couple of variants of like this is a complex page, this is a simple page, fine. But the very first complex page is always slower and longer than the last complex page, and the very first simple page, even if it's just a blog page, that very first page is way harder than the last page. Because even if you're using components, you can just duplicate the main or the wrapper and you've got a new page and then make additions to that. So I think it's the same in that sense. Um,
You win some, you lose some, I suppose, as you're going through the project in terms
yeah,
of time
and
and efficiency.
again, with a lot of these things, like I kind of alluded to it earlier on, like if essentially the client wants it yesterday. So if they get it yesterday, who cares? It's the quicker that you can get something delivered that's working and it's what your boss or your client wants, then it's worth putting in the time into some kind of system. And if that system is just like learning master, learning client first, or creating a whole componentized system, or understanding the CMS to its fullest capabilities, it doesn't matter which way you set up the project. It is going to be easier to make it an addition
Well,
to. Unless it's a
it's
project that you've forgotten about and it's 4 years old and you look back and you're going, oh my God, did I write that? Did I
Yeah.
build
well,
that?
no, it's an interesting
Did I
one. We
change that
we
now to components even though it's completely redundant?
no, but you touched on something there, which was easier and quicker and all this kind of stuff. And we had a pricing episode. I don't know. Was it last year? Maybe at the start of last year or the year before, even I think, where we talked about the old school way of pricing and the agency world. Like we're at, like Alessia, you have an agency, so you're in a little bit more in this space. But some agencies I've worked for or been privy to would be 100% less in the Webflow world, but definitely more in the old school way of building. Is you get asked to do something, you build it, and then the next time someone asks you to do something, you build it. And there's very little sort of forward planning of efficiencies from the client's point of view. I've yet to find an old school agency that would go, look, if we spend an hour extra here, it means that they can build their own pages. Like, because that kind of
Well, they don't
destroys.
want that, right?
Yeah,
Because
the
they don't want
agencies
to
don't want that.
empower the client necessarily.
Exactly, and I think the Webflow world, maybe it's the way they built the tool, or just the general makeup of people using Webflow, developing and designing. Is I feel that there's a lot less of that sort of what's it called, like bait and hook type of, like the Gillette world where they sell you a handle for £2 and then the blades are £5 each, kind of thing, and they realise that that's how they get you into the door. But there has to, I think this is bringing up a bit of a question. Like there has to be a bit of a way off between how we build stuff now because we think it's a great way to build and it's really efficient versus the revenue side of things. But I reckon, I don't know, maybe there's a client or two that I've built for in the past, and if I built them a whole system, I could have come back 6 months later and they could have built out another 100 pages, and I wouldn't have got paid a cent for that, even though I did all the thinking, all the building at the start. So it's not to say that I would ever build it that way so they can't do it, but I think now we almost have to proactively build it so they can do it, and that sometimes
But
butts
I
up
mean,
against each other with our model of like I get paid every month. I got to pay, I got a rent to pay and kids to feed and all that kind of stuff. So
couldn't you see components as the Gillette? So the whole,
ooh,
like, each component is the blade, and you could reuse the same blade until it becomes dull. and you want new blades, and those are new components.
Yeah, it says. Well,
So
let's.
then in the future, like things like retainers, it could be a retainer not to build new pages, but just purely to build new components.
Yeah, so I
But like,
suppose
yeah.
you have that. Yeah, you've built a little bit of a system, and therefore you're the person that comes in and knows how to use the system, so you get paid to build extras on that system, I suppose. But it's a weird dichotomy, isn't it? It's like one side of it you're being made dispensable, maybe on a day-to-day basis, but on a month-by-month basis, maybe you're being made to be indispensable because you're more ingrained or more, you don't want the number 23 bus knocking you over because, damn, like Alessia built this whole system and no one else knows how to use it, kind of thing.
But
Or
I think,
no one else has to build extra bits on it.
like the clients that are going to like do that to you are going to go into the designer anyway, and start playing around with stuff and breaking things. So like if you
Yeah,
set
but
it up,
what happened last time when they break stuff? They give you a call. And I'm not
or
saying,
they blame you, you know.
or they blame you. Yeah, I
Yeah,
suppose.
it depends on the way it is, and it's like someone. It's there is a way of like that's what I was saying. Like and what Alessia was saying as well. Like the easier this system is to use, the less chance there is for them to break stuff, and the more complex it is to use, the um, or the easier you make something that is more complex to use, the more time that takes from you, so it becomes more expensive. So like
And I guess there is the positive vibe of like, if you have a client and you build something for them and you come back to them 6 months later and their site has increased by fivefold by page footprint, it gives you that little warm feeling inside in a geeky kind of way, going, they haven't slacked me, they haven't called me, they haven't emailed me because anything's gone wrong, but their business and their use of the website is working. So I've given them loads of value, so that my stock in their world has gone up. And I suppose that means that they're going to use you more, or they'll use you when they need you. They'll recommend you to more people. All those kind of plus points, I suppose, which is the real measure of success. It's not. It shouldn't be they've called me because something's gone wrong. That shouldn't be like the hook that we should measure ourselves on,
yeah, yeah.
because that
Yeah.
pays the bills, I suppose.
But again, you still have to think of it in terms of like building out a CMS system. Is it, you can let them build, what is it, like 10,000 pages if they wanted with certain CMS plans. So like building out a component system or a CMS system, it's still they still can. That's the value. Like that's what you're selling. Like if someone comes in and says they want, yeah, like a 4 different CMS templates so that they can build out blogs and landing pages that way, you're like, okay, I'll build it out. I always just charged one page to build, even though it was a template and you could build 10,000 of them. So it would be the same kind of thinking with the components and slots and that. And there's always gonna be something they haven't thought about. And I think the creativity that people are going to come up with to build out complex systems that are easy to use, it's going to be really fun. It'll be really exciting to see
Yeah,
what people
that's
build.
that's a good that's a good way. Complex system that are easy to use.
That's kind
Yeah,
of what my goal was, and try to create all these
yeah,
layers.
and that's hard, Alessia. That's hard.
Yeah. And I was also thinking, well, what you said about the massive value that you gave the client, because all of a sudden they created 100 pages by themselves. It's also implying that we should change our way of pricing, or your way of pricing, instead of doing it per page, but more value based, which I always found very, very hard to do, because how do you define or how do you quantify the value that you're adding? But that's kind of a suggestion as well for these design systems, is no longer maybe per component or per page, but the overall value that you are giving to the team, which I don't have the answer to, because
Yeah.
I still haven't been able to measure what that is. But that's a potential next topic discussion, let's say.
No,
of
it's
things.
like it segues onto. I was going to ask both of you to to think about, right, Reloom. Okay, Reloom has been one of the biggest off Webflow apps, let's call them. So successes of the Webflow community. They've done brilliant work. You know, they've started off as building out components in inverted commas, like layouts. They started building layouts and then made them copyable so you could use them in your project. And they're brilliant. And now they built AI on top of it. And you have site builders, and they're pulling out some sort of style guide stuff as well. Is the way that Webflow are going with components and slots a kind of Reloom as it is killer? Because it feels like they're addressing some of the, if you look at your blocks, for example, or the small, medium, large clonable, you know, the framework, and they've got components built into it.
Yeah.
Straight away, you can bring a Reloom component in, but a Reloom layout in, but it doesn't fit with the component system, so it's kind of falls down a bit, you know. So is it the Reloom killer? Like, will Reloom have to move on to different
as
pastures?
it is, there's still quite a few limitations to components. So I feel like my framework is just at the beginning, because to fully be 100% autonomous and 100% component based, you would need Webflow to release quite a few features, especially around the CMS, around maybe conditional visibility and all those like settings that we use, which are not attachable to props. So there's still a few limitations there where I find myself unlinking a component just because it's way easier than creating 10 different components because I filtered the CMS in different ways, for example. But once those are in, it will become a lot more flexible and a lot more usable. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a Reloom killer. It's just because a lot of people still don't like fully componentized, like component-based sites. So I think it's just another way of building. Like there's so many ways of building a website, right? It's either a preference-based, the same way as you use your framework, right? There's a lot of people that use Mast, a lot of people that use client first. One is not necessarily better than the other. It's more of a preference, and it's more of the way that you used to build and what you've learned and how fast you are in those. And sometimes it just based on the design, maybe it lends itself more to a Mast framework, or it lends itself more for a component framework, and so forth. So I wouldn't necessarily call it the Reloom killer, but it's definitely a contestant or like another option to it.
Yeah, sorry, there's a bit of clickbait in that headline there. It's only because I don't really use Reloom. Although, interestingly, I have a friend of mine who I'm helping with the website, and rather than doing all the planning and layouts and stuff, I'm getting them to think about the layout and the content and the flow between pages. And I'm using Reloom to do that. I'm saying, look, this is how it works. Look, you can pull in this section, you can write the basic copy here, the site mapping, all that kind of stuff. And just as we're talking here, I'm thinking, wow, imagine you had that in Webflow where you just presented them a component system that was very, very basic. So it was like, had one image and it had a few variations of buttons and stuff. It would essentially be that system, but a lot more malleable. You could hide stuff, you could introduce stuff, they could drag new buttons in. Like Reloom, you can't do it as much because it's all based on sort of certain layout systems. It could be a template that you could sell, and Bob's your uncle, you got like an MVP Webflow component template that if you wanted to in the future, you could turn into a real site. Or you could just use it for testing, MVPs, or doing user testing, or internally for talking about content flows and all that kind of stuff. So that's my next project. I'll do it in 2027.
That just gave me an idea for my framework, actually, because at the moment it's just on Webflow. There's no Figma equivalent. But in Figma, you also have component variants, right? So you could have different, actually, you didn't, I'll have to think about it because you don't necessarily have slots, right, in Figma where you can drop
No,
stuff in.
I suppose you have auto layout to a certain extent, but that
Yeah.
it's not as clear cut as it.
No, so it would be a little bit more limiting, but going back with the grid example, you can have one component in Figma, and then you have different variants for the columns, and then you set kind of, you mirror that same layout in Webflow, so they're very similar. But I'll need to think about how that would work without slots necessarily in Figma.
Yeah. Oh, and do you think Webflow are going to develop sort of any marketplaces outside of like a component marketplace? Because it feels like the more like Alan will always say, it's like we are the product, so we're kind of and there is a danger that you build all these systems in one product and you can't pull yourself out of that product because so many of those things are really pivotal to how a site works. Is that they could have a component library like a Reloom or like the flow based one, where you literally can buy a component for $5 and stick it in your site, and it would, you've got to, again, it's mixed up with the class system and what kind of frameworks you use and the naming conventions and all this kind of stuff. But maybe that's a route that might go down in the future, where you can buy a template, which is a base template, and then you can buy components off the top of it that you can just, like libraries, like, because Webflow have component libraries, which we haven't even
But they're
covered that, which
workspace specific.
in a workspace, but they don't really transfer very well across workspaces at the moment, do they? So
Yeah. Because
yeah,
they did introduce component libraries where you have
yeah,
Reloom and Finsui and like other ones in there, but I think I haven't tried them yet, but I don't think they're component.
no,
They're more like
they're
layout
layouts, yeah, yeah,
libraries. And there, I think there was a hint of marketplace where some could be free and some could be paid for.
yeah,
So I wonder if they will extend that to proper components, let's call them, instead of layout
yeah.
libraries.
Feels like a gold mine. Reloom then wouldn't be a Reloom killer; it'd be just another channel to you could really really go to town with Reloom and those kind of guys. So
Yeah.
but anyway, we've been talking for a long, long time. I don't know. We covered quite a lot, but I think we could go on for days with components because I think
Oh
there's
yeah,
so
for
much
sure.
to. We didn't really talk about variants that much, or like slots still confuse me a little bit. Like I've played around with slots a bit, and I found that there's certain behaviors that they do that you don't think about. Like sliders, for example, like slots for sliders. I was like, oh, I'm going to put slots in the slider, and then the slots themselves still exist. So when I was using JavaScript to say, turn off the buttons when there's no items on the page, or items off the page, for example, the slider's only got 3 cards instead of 10.
Yeah.
It was still looking at the slots, and those slots were off the page. So it was still counting them. And so you have to use a bit more JavaScript to go, oh, but only if they've got this class on them. And,
I'm gonna do a self plug here. Sorry.
Go for it.
But I've got, so the whole component library is currently as a clonable, even though it's still work in progress. But there is a swiper component in there, which is
Ooh.
divided into kind of 3 different components at the moment. But I've got, yeah, try it out and tell me what you think, because that is a swiper component with different attributes for most of the swiper attributes that you might need, like slides per view or like the gap between them and so forth. And you can drop in different slides and it will automatically kind of work.
So there's like each slide is almost a slot, is it?
So with Swiper.js, you have the swiper and then swiper wrapper and then the slide.
Yeah.
So the swiper wrapper is the slot.
Okay.
And
So
then you're
that has
dropping
certain
in the
attributes.
swiper
Yeah.
slide inside of it.
And then in that swiper slide, you essentially could have slots for different, you could have buttons and images, different layouts in that swiper slide. Yeah. Aline, Aline's will be laughing here because I had a swiper idea with custom swiper stuff that worked with Webflow with a component. I built it, and he's like, "Right, you got to release this," and I have it on my list to do, and I've never got around to doing it. So,
let's compare notes.
Yeah.
no, you're way down the road here. You're way down the road. It's my perennial problem of coming up with a great idea, doing a proof of concept, and then not doing anything with it. So, I'm chuffed that you've. So blocks is that the name of your, is that the working title, or that's the title of your component?
Work in progress.
Component framework, yeah.
Yeah, the component framework, currently called blocks. It might change because I've got some feedback where it says, because the idea behind blocks is building blocks, and you can like drag and drop them. But then someone pointed out blocks also kind of means like blockage, or like it's blocking you. So when you're telling to clients, do you want blocks in this, and might take it the wrong way.
I don't know.
Work in
blocks
progress.
is quite good, I think. Like, because you can have Lego blocks and you can have Duplo blocks, different types of complex blocks.
Yeah.
Everyone knows what a block is. You build houses with blocks, don't you?
Yeah, or bricks.
Yeah, bricks.
You could call it bricks, maybe.
Yeah, I think there's something called bricks already, isn't
Brick
there?
Studio, and they've got bricks templates, isn't it?
But there's also bricks. A bricks not with the X. That's bricks with an X. There's also bricks, a component clonable in Webflow as well.
Oh.
Yeah, all the names. Anyway, let's. I've actually got a hard cutoff today, which is unfortunate. But thanks, Alessia. Thanks for jumping in and chewing the fat, as we call it.
All good.
How are
Always
the cows
happy
doing?
to be here.
They're
How are
gone.
the cows doing? They're gone. The cows are gone.
They're gone. Yeah.
Oh, whose doorbell was that? Was that yours?
It was mine. It was
Yours.
mine.
Oh, there we go. Right on cue.
Go answer your door. We'll see you later. Right.
Great. Thanks so much, guys.
Bye-bye.
See you
Okay.
soon.
Bye, guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.